Therefore, indeed, I send you. Now look at verse 34. Therefore, I send you prophets, wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. Jesus says, I send you prophets. Only God sends prophets. He is plainly speaking as Jehovah here. I mean, he's not even trying to, cover it up. He's plainly speaking as Jehovah. I send you prophets, wise men and scribes, and some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. You see that in the book of Acts. That on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel, who was the first person murdered, to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah. Zechariah was the last prophet murdered in the Old Testament, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Verse 36, assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Abel was killed by his brother Cain, and Abel, remember, was killed because his offering was acceptable to God, and Cain's offering was unacceptable to God. And Cain was jealous and killed him, and so the one who was unacceptable or unaccepted killed the one who was accepted. And this is a pattern all through the Old Testament, even up to Jesus Christ. The one who is accepted by God and whose worship and sacrifice is accepted by God is killed by those whose sacrifice is unaccepted by God. Remember, Paul tells us in Romans that the Jewish people were trying to establish their own righteousness because they rejected the righteousness that God provided through Jesus Christ. So their righteousness was unaccepted, and they killed the righteousness that is accepted by God. And he's saying here that all of the blood of the righteous prophets will be on this generation, because again, all those Old Testament prophets that were killed, all those Old Testament prophets were pointing to the Messiah who would come. And this generation of leaders will kill the Messiah who came. And so this final section here in verse 37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. He laments over Jerusalem, and he says, how often I wanted to gather your children together. And Jesus is not talking only about his 3.5-year earthly ministry. Again, Jesus is speaking as Jehovah here, as God, and he's talking about throughout their history, throughout the history of Jerusalem, throughout the Old Testament times, God wanted to gather Jerusalem to himself, but they weren't willing. God wanted to gather them, but instead they refused and they rejected God. And we see this. We've seen this on our Thursday night study with going through the prophets. And God sent prophet after prophet after prophet to Jerusalem, and they kept rejecting the prophets and rejecting the prophets. And all God wanted to do was gather his children together and protect them and provide for them and love them. And they refused. They weren't willing to receive God's love and God's protection. They rejected him. And so verse 38, see, your house is left to you desolate. The temple will be destroyed in 70 A.D. by the Romans, and God's house is still desolate to this day. There's no temple in Jerusalem. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And that's from Psalm 118. We've talked about that before when Jesus made his triumphal entry. That is the greeting, the messianic greeting, how the Messiah is to be greeted when he comes, with the words, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And here Jesus says the Jewish people will not see him again until they receive him as their Messiah and greet him with the words, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And that will be at his second coming. In Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, God says, "I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication, and then they will look to me whom they pierced." When did the people of Jerusalem ever pierce God? When they nailed him to a cross and crucified Jesus Christ. And so he says this. Now again, look at verse 1 of chapter 24. "And then Jesus went out and departed from the temple." Jesus left the temple, and this is his last public sermon. He has come to the Jewish people as their Messiah. He has given them numerous teachings showing that he's the Messiah. He has worked numerous messianic miracles showing that he's the Messiah. He's given all this evidence that he is the promised Messiah that was promised in the Old Testament. And they have rejected him. And so now he stops. And this is it. He's given them the opportunity to receive him. They've rejected him. And now he's finished with his public ministry.